last will and testament session we did on Friday. And today I wanted to get your opinions and, around business insurance, but specifically today, buy and sell agreements. And thanks for agreeing that later on we'll touch on the key man insurance and the contingency liability. And even though we will touch on buy and sell agreements today, share buyback, we're going to go into a lot more detail in our next session. So we just wanted to lay the foundation work in business insurance with buy and sell agreements. So this is when somebody has bought over a company or started a company with partners or shareholders, other shareholders, and they have done their memorandum of incorporation and they've got a shareholders agreement, but they wanted added security by doing a buy and sell agreement. Maybe not necessary if the shareholders agreement was set up correctly, but the wording has to be quite specific if you want to buy back to transfer shares correctly. So, I mean, part of this agreement, part of this discussion will be, the definition of a buy and sell agreement, the funding, why is the agreement essential, benefits to the enterprise, some steps, how does a marital regime play a role in this, and company buyback. So what is your kind of definition of a buy and sell agreement? Is that this definition we got here is an agreement between parties that binds them to sell their respective interest in the enterprise to the remaining parties and force the other parties to buy the interest in case of death or disability, also sets the price. Would you say that's a fairly descriptive definition?
Yes. Hello, Greg. I think for me that's absolutely spot on. I think normally the word from a legal point of view, we actually say put an obligation on the remaining parties to acquire the shares of the deceased partner or where the person is disabled. But the definition is spot on. I think the two parts for me is the one is actually having an agreement in place that's going to actually put an obligation on the remaining parties to buy the shares, and also an obligation on the deceased estate in case of death to acquire those shares or to sell those shares from the estate. And normally that's where the executor will step in. Another thing that I just want to actually add on here is actually, so there's two components. The one is actually the agreement that's going to put an obligation on either the buyer or the seller. And the second one is the funding, because no funding, then absolutely no point in having an agreement in place, because then there's no cash available to acquire those shares from the deceased estate, for example. So, but 100% correct, that is actually sort of in a nutshell what is the definition of the buy and sell agreement.
Yeah, because we're taking for granted that people realize that if you're in a company and you own shares in a company, those shares are going to your estate. And like we spoke about last week, Friday, your will and testament is going to leave your estate. Sell agreement does. It comes in between. Allows the other partners or shareholders to come to your executor and buy those shares from the estate.
100% correct. 100%. So what's going to happen is if we take the insurance policy, for example, because that is the funding mechanism, there can be different funding mechanisms as well if a person cannot actually get life cover. But yes, the remaining parties will get the insurance from the insurance company or the proceeds of the policy where they're the owner or either the beneficiary of that policy. And the contract or the buy and sell agreement will actually put an obligation on those remaining shareholders to immediately actually pay over those funds to the executor or to the estate of the person who passed away. So yes, that's going to be sort of the process really. And at the end of the day, one must actually think about the consequences as well for the deceased estate. Just quickly there from a capital gains tax point of view, and that's where the necessary planning comes in, or the link from the business insurance to the personal insurance, making sure there is enough funding in the personal estate, and whether that will also be subject to capital gains tax, estate duty, etc.
Yeah, and I mean, we've often seen it that we've had clients that have put life cover in place, but haven't bothered to put the buy and sell agreement in place. I mean, just because you've got the funding sorted out doesn't mean that you've got a buy and sell agreement. I mean, a lot of insurance consultants are very proactive in getting the life cover in place. But then when something actually happens and we ask to produce the agreement, there's no one's actually signed it. I think that's also very important to people realize that to get that agreement signed is essential.
Greg, it's so important. I'll tell you what, and when I started off with my career, one of the first things I got involved with is where there was actually a company. A company wasn't doing that well at the end when the person passed away, but in the beginning they took out life cover policies, but they never signed an agreement. The worst part for me was that the person who passed away was married with 2 minor kids, no real other assets in the estate and so on. So this family was really looking for to get the proceeds of the policy and so on to go to the estate where they can actually live from, if I can put it that way. At the end of the day, we went to council, everything and so on. No agreement was in place, and the remaining partner just kept the money in his policy. We couldn't force him to actually pay over that money to the estate. So it's absolutely crucial that the agreement must be signed. Policy must be in place. Those are the 2 requirements. So without that, then actually you actually find that the estate, there will be problems actually managing that estate. Just from a statistic point of view, the last time I checked the stats on how many of these cases you will find a signed agreement in place, people have put their funding in place, taking out the policies. I think the last I've seen was something like in 70% of cases, there will be no signed agreement in place. And that's a huge risk. It can be either for the person buying, it can be either also for the person that's actually selling the shares and so on. So yes, the agreement must be put in place, a signed agreement.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just talks to maybe what we've repeated here, but the agreement is essential for the surviving owners, ensures payment at market-related purchase price. And that's the other thing. I mean, when you put that valuation of the business into the agreement, you can't just thumbsuck that agreement. It's got to be a true valuation. And an overvaluation or an undervaluation, it must be market related. You otherwise you're seen as donating or underpaying the survivor, the deceased estate.
I think it's the important date is date of an exception of the policy. That's where you need a proper valuation, or at least sort of an estimate. And it's normally the auditor of that company who is going to actually place a value on different methods of as well. That at that inception of the policy, that is the time that SARS is going to look at it. If you take out a policy and it was way more than the value of the company or your shares at that particular date, and let's say for whatever reason the company is actually even reduced further, then there is a possibility that SARS may look at it from an estate duty point of view, that there's going to be a estate duty payable on that policy because now you acquired or you taken out a policy way more than the real value, and that can be a problem. On the other side as well, it can also be a bit of an issue if you don't take out enough life cover and there's an increase in the value of the shares that you don't have enough funding to pay the purchase price. So one must update the value on a regular basis, on a yearly basis as well. But absolutely important also what you've mentioned there, potentially donation tax also applicable if you actually sell a company that's low in value or the valuation is low in value, and you actually get not enough in the purchase price or the proceeds of the purchase price in your estate.
And then in your world where you're winding up estates, dealing with the client's last will and testament, I mean, I would think that if you're going to be partners with somebody in a business, is number one, make sure everybody's got a last will and testament. And especially when you bring in shares into an estate, by having a buy and sell agreement, all these things correctly in place, it must help to wind up that person's deceased estate.
Yeah, because you actually then sit with different type of interested parties. I've had it before as well. where if I take the different sort of or interested parties, you talk about the deceased estate or the family members or the beneficiaries of that estate. Yeah, what do they want to get out of that agreement? They want actually, or out of the company, they want to get dividends. The remaining shareholders, they want growth in that company. So that can be a bit of a sort of a clashing of interest there. So I like to actually have a proper agreement in place, proper valuations and so on. And maybe I must just touch upon the valuations, because I think when the client is still alive, to get the funding by way of a policy and put an agreement in place, that's one part of it. If the shares are forming part of your personal estate, especially if you sell it, we got the Chief Revenue Inspector at SARS offices. Now, what happens is then they're going to ask for a proper valuation as a date of death, and also for balance sheets 2 years prior to the date of death. And they normally look at those values. So coming back to what we said, no, undervaluation of a company or overvalue of a company and so on, one must be very careful, because SARS ultimately will actually have access to this information of the valuation as a date of death and 2 years prior to date of death. So they'll have access to this information, and this is where they potentially can start asking questions about the policy that was taken out, a date of exception, and all those type of questions on. But if you're okay with the policy at date of inception, whatever happens with that company afterwards, then you're safe. So I was going to now come back and say the company is actually, the value is dropped. Now suddenly there's a state duty payable on the policy on all those type of cases, or there's now donation tax because the remaining shareholders are acquiring a particular asset at way more or way less than the real valuation at date of exception. So, but yes, that's a vital question for me when we administer an estate. The Chief Revenue Inspector, Cobus Visser, will start asking for a value as a date of death, and also 2 years of balance sheets prior to date of death.
And benefits for the enterprise. I mean, that's just standard. We've got continuation, viability of the enterprise. So, you know, when I look at this, I always say to them, to clients is, you know, you've got your normal hat, individual person, you wear that hat when you're dealing with your own matters. But it's important that if you're a director or a shareholder of a business, you need to put your business hat on, and you need to make decisions for the best interest of the business, not just the best interest of you as the shareholder.
Yes, I've already mentioned about the different interested parties and so on to that business. Let's say if you haven't got a buy and sell agreement in place, suddenly you're going to have family members, children of the family potentially is going to come on board as a shareholder. Maybe they don't know anything about the business and so on.
Or sell those shares to somebody else, an outsider. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. And there also the problem is actually to find buyers in the market for those shares. I've had a case the other day and so on, and if outside or third parties, they're not really interested in buying into a business where it's actually almost like a family business, if I can put it that way. They don't like to step into that sort of environment. So coming back to what we said, to get a proper buy and sell agreement in place. I call it succession planning.
Yes.
And don't allow family members, if they're not part of the business, they were never part of the business, and suddenly now you get like family members to dictate to the remaining shareholders as to how they must run a business. I've already mentioned about the problem is that the remaining shareholders are looking for growth in the company. So maybe they're not going to declare dividends, and the family members that inherited from that estate, maybe the surviving spouse, she's looking at it in a different way. She's looking at where she can get the most income from, and the only way to get that income is by declaration of dividends. So there's a bit of a clash of interest, and so I like still coming back to have a proper buy and sell agreement in place.
And I think we've touched on most of the stuff here. When it comes to the funding part of it, and you've got your life cover in place, you want to, the premiums need to be paid by the owners, or being seen as being paid by the owners. So we can use loan accounts, or the people can pay it directly from their own bank accounts.
Yeah, actually, that's another thing. I normally, with the different sort of ways of dealing with it, you can either do a traditional buy and sell arrangement, or you can do a share buyback. And the reason why I'm mentioning it, because it also becomes very important when you start having a look at premiums, who's liable for payment of the premiums. I like to keep it simple. It's like the owner of a house. If you're the owner of a house, you're responsible for paying of your bond, your monthly bond installment. The same year, if you structure the policy in such a way where the remaining shareholders actually will acquire the shares from the deceased partner, so the remaining shareholders will be the owner of that policy. And I know with some insurance companies, they add the beneficiary onto that. So that means that the owner of the policy will have to pay the premium. So if the company is normally paying for it, then there are different ways of actually doing the adjustment. And I struggle with that because really in the market, I don't really see that where people talk to the auditors to make this necessary adjustment. So, but if the company is paying the premium, it can either be adjusted by way of a fringe benefit, so to that owner of the policy where he's going to pay
on
tax.
The salary slip.
Yes, 100% correct. The next way of declaring a dividend to that individual, or the last one is where you have a situation where that will be treated as a loan. But if it's a loan from the company, there's another part in our Income Tax Act where it will be seen as almost like a benefit to that shareholder. So the interest component, if you don't charge interest on that loan, the interest component will also be seen as a deemed dividend each and every tax year. So one must be very careful and have these discussions with the auditor as to make those necessary adjustments. I just want to add something else here as well, Greg, is that if the company is paying the premium, and I've seen a particular case where there was no adjustment, and SAR's argument was that, but then indirectly, the deceased party has also paid for the premium, because remember, there are different shareholders, and one of them being the deceased person as well. If the company paid for it and there was no adjustment to the other shareholders, if I can put it that way, by way of a fringe benefit, loan account, or dividend, then it can be seen that the policy was also paid by the deceased. And then where you would have actually received an exemption on estate duty on that policy may be subject to payment of estate duty as well. So one must be very careful with these policies and the premiums, and make sure the necessary adjustments has been made to the owner of the policy who must pay the premium. One last thing maybe from my side is now it's all good and well if you've got individuals. And normally when I actually interview people, I start asking for organogram as to find out who are the shareholders, because then you'll actually know whether it's an individual or a company or a trust structure. So if you talk about premiums that the company is paying, now how do you do that adjustment to a trust or to another company where you're talking about either by way of a fringe benefit or a loan or declaring a dividend? So most of the time they don't declare dividends, so they do it by way of a fringe benefit, not a loan. And then my advice in those particular cases to start looking at share buyback schemes where the company will pay the premium and the company will be collecting the proceeds of the policy and acquire the shares from either that company or that trust. All depends on the structure. But always start with the structure to understand your structure or your organogram, and then you can make the right decisions regarding as to who must buy who, whether it's going to be a share buyback, and especially on the payment of the premiums as to where it must be allocated to.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And then obviously the estate duty, I think we've kind of touched on it, but it's important that, in any other situation, normal life cover, we're talking from a funding point of view now, the shares are deemed property. You can't do anything like that about that. Your shares of your company in your estate is going to be deemed property and attract estate duty. And your personal life cover is also deemed property and is going to attract estate duty. Why? But how do we make sure that the funding life cover that we use to fund the buy and sell agreement, how do we make sure that that doesn't attract estate duty?
Okay, so let's maybe start with the first one, because we're talking about two different type of events. The first one is actually life cover and because of death, and the next one is because of disability. I just want to clear this because when you talk about disability, so no real need to add any estate duty onto that policy if the policy is subject to payment of estate duty, for example. Okay.
Yeah.
The reason is because we're not talking about death, so it's not a deemed asset for estate duty purposes. So I just want to clear that one. That's really the starting point. If we talk about the State Duty Act, normally there are certain exemptions. So normally a policy is subject to payment of a state duty. Reason is because of the death of a person. Then it's immediately a deemed asset for state duty purpose. So what you're referring to here, Greg, is that if you don't have those exemptions, then the policy will be subject to a state duty. So if I can maybe just talk about business insurance or buy and sell specifically, I think we'll probably later on touch upon continued liabilities and key man policies, but let's just talk about buy and sell arrangements. So if it's a traditional buy and sell between individuals or natural persons, so what's going to happen there is the policy will be exempt if it's structured correctly. So if I've got 3 shareholders, 2 shareholders will be the owner of the policy on the life of the third, and the 2 owners of the policy will pay the premium of the policy. If the company is paying it, then there'll be an adjustment by the auditor regarding fringe benefit or loan or dividend. If that policy gets paid out to the remaining shareholders, then there'll be no estate duty payable on the life cover. Again, remember what I said, if there's disability payment, there is no estate duty to be added or value to be added to the amount or the life cover amount, as there will be no estate duty applicable. So that's a first really exemption from an estate duty point of view. If you talk about a natural person and a trust, if the natural person is acquiring the shares from a trust, there is a SARS notice that explains everything. But if the individual is buying from the trust or the trustee, where the life will be insured of that particular trustee or the main trustee, if I can put it that way, then estate duty need to be added. So normally what I do is, if it's R1 million life cover that be acquired, I just take that amount and I divide by 0.8 to cater for 20% estate duty, or 25% divide by 0.75, and that will give you a new amount, because that policy will be subject to payment of estate duty. If I turn it the other way around, where the trust is acquiring the shares from the natural person or that person's estate, then the policy will be exempt from payment of estate duty. The reason is because of the SARS notice that we've received. If we talk about 2 trusts that's acquiring the shares from each other, then the policy will not be exempt from payment of estate duty. So then you add estate duty on top of the value that you need for the funding of that, of the acquiring of the shares. Now the same principle will apply whether you're dealing with a CC or PTY or trust, where the natural person is buying from a CC or PTY, the same principles, and vice versa as well. The most important is just to understand that these policies may not be exempt from payment of estate duty. And if you're not sure, just talk to an expert that can give you guidance as to whether estate duty is applicable or not, and as to how these policies must be structured. If I take one last one, maybe just quickly on the share buybacks, and I know we will probably discuss it at a later point. Share buybacks is simple, really. The policy company will be the owner of the policy, and you need to add estate duty on top of that, because you will not have the estate duty exemption.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that was just a little slide, but what I wanted to then jump over to is a practical example that you and I had looked at. So yeah, we've got a company, and we've said, there's 5 owners in this company, and A, B, C, and D are individuals, and E is a company, and we've taken out life cover, or we're looking at taking out life cover for A, B, C, and D at this stage, even though we could probably get life cover for the person that owns this company, or whoever owns that company. But when we got quotes for the life cover for A, B, C, and D, and E, A, B, C, and D, these people are all different ages, different sexes. So even if they had equal shareholding, the premium would be different. As it is, the shareholding is completely different. So A shareholder has 36%, B shareholder has 7%, C shareholder has 7%, D shareholder has 5%. And depending on the sex and the amount of cover, these were the life cover premiums for that life cover. So what this table then shows us, and you'll be correct, you can just correct me when I'm wrong, is that even though the total premium here is 11,961 and they're all shareholders, they pay different portions of that life cover. And this is what you were talking about as far as either showing this as a fringe benefit or be careful how you show it in the loan accounts, because I mean, if I double click on here, we'll see the actual calculation. It's a percentage of a percentage. So this B, who's got 7% shareholding, will pay 1,300 Rand of that 11,900 Rand premium. And this remains true if you then go and look at from B shareholding, C shareholding, and D shareholding. And what I always found interesting when you break up this premium and what the different people must be allocated to pay for is it's actually the same shareholding or percentage as if A died. If A passed away, B would have 3.53% more shares in this business. So their shareholding would go from 7% up to 10.53% after A's death, because of that 36% that A had, the two people that have got 7% shareholdings, their shareholding will grow by 3.5% after that death. And where the company that owns 48%, because they were paying for some of that premium, their shareholding would grow by 26%. But how would you handle E, where we said, okay, well, we can't insure a company? How would you handle when you've got a natural person we can give life cover to, but is it true that we can give life cover to the owners of that company that own the shares in this business, or do we have to go another route?
Yeah, let me maybe just explain that those calculations that you've explained to us, Greg, is that because most of the time the buy and sell agreements will actually have a stipulation that the remaining shareholders will acquire their shares pro rata their shareholdings. So what we are saying is that based on the remaining shareholders, if I take A, for example, with remaining shareholders 7%, 7%, and 5%, and 45% pro rata their shareholding, that's the reason why the premium to be paid by company E is way more than the other shareholders. So one must just actually find out what's the intention of each and every of the shareholders in the company, because I've actually have in fact seen it where they're not really buying shares pro rata their shareholding, but they're prepared to buy equally. Let me explain it quickly. So if I've got 36% in where A is the shareholder, they may decide, okay, but hold on, company E is not going to acquire any more shares because there's a possibility there's a majority vote. So one must be careful for that as well. So they may decide that it's only going to be B, C, and D that's going to acquire their shares from A, for example. I think that let me just start with that one. So, but yes. So let's quickly.
So in that scenario, these people would have a buyout of their shares separately, and this would change proportionally to that. You would recalculate it. Together, these people own 52 million of a business. So you'd recalculate based on that and leave E out of the equation in that scenario.
100% correct. 100%. So one must actually think about that as well. But let's just talk about the company. Most of the time, the structure of that particular company will be where we've got A, B, C, and D as individuals and holding their shares in their personal name. Let's say it was person E. That person, I'll maybe explain why they're doing it. Maybe person E's decided, okay, I'm not going to hold these shares in my personal name. I'm going to do a Section 42 transfer. And what I mean by Section 42 transfer in terms of the Income Tax Act, they do an asset for share transfer. And then what will actually happen, the person E as individual will then actually have a shareholding in company E. But we call it a holding company. So natural person E has decided I'm going to actually have a holding company who's going to hold my shares in the operational business. Then it's actually then really simple and straightforward if he's the only shareholder in that company, because you'll take out life insurance on his name. So if something happens with the natural person E, there will be a life cover policy. The policy will be payable to remaining shareholders, and then they will actually acquire the shares of that particular company. Let's call it company E. But I normally like the structure. The moment if you've got a holding company, is rather to have a look at a share buyback principle, because if you have a look at A, B, C, and D, that's going to acquire the shares of E in that company E. You're anyway going to have estate duty payable on that policy, so you might as well just have the company being the owner of the policy, deal with it by way of a share buyback. Then there's no allocation of any premiums to the individuals anyway, where the policy will be subject to payment of estate duty. The benefit of actually having this structure is that we will have a choice, because the operational company is going to get the proceeds of the policy after payment of estate duty, and they'll pay the money over to the holding company, company E. The benefit of that is that you can get away with capital gains tax, because that transaction is a deemed dividend for tax purposes. And then what's going to happen is, between companies in South Africa, there's no dividends tax. So the money will flow after estate duty from the operational company into company E. And then the family members can decide whatever they want to do with the holding company. So they can either actually take the money out of the holding company and declare dividend, or they can keep their funds within the holding company and start investing it in that particular holding company. So again, yes, Greg, it all depends on the structure, the intention of the parties, looking at the premium as to which is going to be the best to deal with that particular scenario.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's sums it up for today, and then we'll get into the share buyback, the contingency liability, the key man, and all those other topics that we cover with business insurance. But thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk again.
Thank you very much, Greg, and talk to you again. Cheers.